Hello, and welcome back to In Search of Black Power. I'm your co-host, Lawrence Grand Prix. Votes are still being counted as of the recording of this podcast, but the result of the election appears clear. Donald Trump will return to the White House. Many people have given many forms of analysis about this result. Some are saying that it proves the Democrats went too far to the left, they're anti-politics, overcoding the economic successes of the Biden-Harris administration. Others are saying it proves that the reality of the ongoing genocide in Gaza and the Democratic Party's inability to deliver for working-class folks of all races, but including Black Americans, explains the decreases in turnout that produced this result. So as a follow-up to the episode we did before the election, myself and LBS Director of Public Policy Dayvon are going to engage in a conversation talking about what happened, what we think some of the causes were, where we think the Democratic Party might be going, and how we, as a Black community, should organize ourselves so that no matter what the results of any future elections are, our interests and our needs will be met and accounted for. I want to thank all of you who will continue to listen to the podcast, who like to support. Go to lbsbaltimore.com. Thank you to Black Liberation Media. Please support the continuing work that the collective is doing at Black Liberation Media. And continue to support us as we work on a variety of efforts to do state and local policy here in Maryland, and also continuing to engage in the issues that we work on, be it drug policy, violence prevention, trying to build capacity and support to support other folks around the country. So, thank you. And I will see you all on the other side after we finish this conversation between myself and LBS Director of Public Policy, Dayvon Love.
All right, this is Dayvon Love. I'm with Lawrence Grand Prix, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle in Search of Black Power. This is our episode in discussing the outcome of the 2024 election and its implications on not just our work, but just a general political landscape, particularly as it relates to Black people. And so first, Lawrence is just going to give just a general recap of, what happened in this past election.
So I think this is important because there are a lot of narratives swirling around, and it's important. We don't have to exhaustively look at the data, but let's think about what we actually know. So we know it's not all the votes are counted yet, but Donald Trump is going to win very convincingly in the Electoral College, basically sweeping all of the swing states. Of course, the election is not decided by the popular vote, it's decided by the electoral vote. Donald Trump is going to end up, in my calculations, with about 2 or 3 million more votes than he got last time. The Democratic Party is going to end up with about 7 million less votes than they got last time. This is projecting the votes that are yet to come in from the West Coast. The West Coast votes very slowly. So for Donald Trump, this was a high turnout election because 2020 was an extremely high turnout election. For the Democrats, we see a collapse of turnout in many different demographics. We do see some small shift of Black men towards Trump. We see an overwhelming shift in the rural areas and amongst Latino men towards Trump. However, in the Senate, the Democrats actually did pretty well. They actually won in a lot of swing states where Kamala actually lost. So states like Nevada, Arizona, Democrats actually won. And the Democrats are going to lose the House. And this has not been projected at the time of this recording. But they're almost certainly going to lose the House, and they're going to have about a 4 or 5 seat majority for the Republicans in the House. So definitely an overwhelming electoral college victory for Trump. Definitely a popular vote victory for Trump of about 2 points. But the Democrats kept it very close in the swing states. The swing states were closer than some of the other states. But we see a definite collapse in turnout from the Democrats compared to 2020, including continual soft turnout in traditional Democratic Party strongholds like major cities, Philadelphia, Milwaukee, despite all of the investment in get out the vote campaigns and targeted media. We do see soft turnout in some of these major strong points. We do see some shift of college-educated white women towards the Democrats. We see her holding some of that 2020 vote in some of these suburbs, but not nearly enough to counteract the massive shifts in rural areas the decreased turnout in the inner cities, and just a general shift towards Trump in almost all areas of the country, except for some small outliers in the Atlanta suburbs and a few other random places around the country. So, Dayvon, now that we've level set, what are your thoughts on that?
So I think there are a couple of things to, just in terms of context setting before talking specifically about the 2024 general election. I think the first part, it's important for people to recognize that the American electorate is generally disengaged. So while there is, the numbers of turnout in the general election usually fluctuates either a little bit below 50%. In 2020, it was actually a bit above 50%. Large swath of the American electorate is generally disengaged. And then if you think about participation in primaries, right, that the participation of the American electorate in primaries is generally extremely low. So in many respects, the people who are voting for in a general election are usually voted for by, in many respects, a very small minority of people who actually turn out to vote. And I think what we see even in mainstream media is a level of dissatisfaction with the two-party system, in many ways at its zenith. And so we saw more discourse and conversation about third-party candidates than probably we've seen. And in many ways that I think has been building over the years, but I think certainly a much bigger focus on alternative parties outside of the duopoly two-party system. And so, and it's important, I think, to recognize that given, these are things that have been building up over time. So these weren't dynamics that suddenly appeared in 2024. There is a core really within both parties. But I think for the purposes of our conversation about the Democratic Party, of which black folks in many respects are a captured electorate, that there is a core of the Democratic Party, consultants, people who are Democratic Party operatives, who they answer to are major donors, the corporate wing or the corporate folks that constitute the Democratic Party ecosystem. Whether it's tech, healthcare industry, elements of Wall Street, that there's this elite core of Democratic Party operatives and consultants for whom going too far in the direction of meeting the needs of working class black people and just working class black people in general are at odds with this core of the Democratic Party is in their professional and financial self-interest. So that fundamental dynamic, I think, is an important thing to just put overlay on how we interpret and discuss the 2024 general election, of which I don't think that there's nearly enough conversation in corporate media. I think we're seeing, lots of that conversation on some of the alternative media that's emerged over the past few years. But again, that's something that I don't think garners enough conversation in some of those contexts. I think that what has happened is that many of the major spokespeople, whether it's media on the political landscape, who target black people, what has happened is that many of the narratives of black people's participation in the electoral process is about wanting to elect people that can meet our needs, as opposed to a framework which I think is much more salient, which is we as a people need to be contesting for power. That the electoral space is a space of political warfare, that as people of African descent, we need to be contesting for power and see it that way. That we need to be contesting for public resources, contesting for policies that best meet the needs of our community. And again, this is a different mindset than we need to elect people that'll be good representatives for us. And not that it's bad to have good representatives, but that we need to be clear that in a society, that's imperialist, white supremacist, as an extensive colonial white supremacist as a settler colony, like this isn't a society that American democracy is a farce. And that to the extent that we need to be engaged in the political arena is about contesting for power in a context by which we're impacted by the institutions of, the status quo. So to me, that's like context setting. So even before talking about specifically the 2024 election and the outcome, I think this context it's good that it overlays how we talk about 2024.
Yeah. So I think that's important to interpret some of the narratives coming out of this election. Some people are saying Biden's policies were so great for the middle class, but he didn't care because they were so racist. And I think part of what we're seeing is that the aperture, the frame for what was on the table for policy was so limited that even being to the quote-unquote left of Obama and Hillary was so far outside of what people in general needed, but specifically black people needed, that it fails to truly understand the dynamic. I was actually looking at some exit polling that broke down why people felt they didn't want to vote for Kamala. And black people were the most likely to say they did not create enough jobs of all the groups by a substantial margin. So this idea that the jobs that were created were proof that the Democrats delivered for black people, but they were so racist and sexist they couldn't hear it, that's not the reality many people experience. So even beyond inflation is the narrowing. Because I remember that being a conversation about an infrastructure bill about 10, 15 years ago. And they were talking about a $5 to $10 trillion infrastructure bill 10 to 15 years ago. So to pass a $2 trillion infrastructure bill now and to claim that you've delivered, the solutions on offer from the Democratic Party are so far outside to the scale of the problem that should be the focus of people's analysis, not the accusations that people were racist or sexist against Kamala.
Yeah, and I think so. And so a couple of things to add to that is that what precipitated the infrastructure bill, or what followed it, or preceded it rather, was the pandemic. So much of the social spending that the Biden administration ended up doing was in response to a once-in-a-century global health catastrophe, in conjunction with a wing of the Democratic Party that is maligned by the Democratic Party establishment. And anybody who has watched, particularly some of the news coverage from many of the independent lefty media on the infrastructure bill, I think it's evidence that the Biden administration, to the extent that it had to go in the direction that it went to do the infrastructure plan and American Rescue Plan, that all of that, again, buttressed by the fact that there was a pandemic and by the pressure from a wing of the Democratic Party that is maligned by the establishment. One of the things that I also want to add on to what you just mentioned is around the scale, not the scale, there's a way that when the political norm is so far to the right, little things are made to sound like big things. That makes sense if you're having an intellectual conversation. That does not make sense when you're talking about people's real material lived realities. Because what ends up happening, like you mentioned, like there were significant things that were able to be invested in as a result of the infrastructure bill and as a result of the American Rescue Plan. And we have worked on things that have benefited from, some of that federal funding, whether it's, community-based violence prevention, some of the support we advocated for the Pennsylvania Black Arts Entertainment District. There are a wide range of organizations that received resources, from this pot. One time, in many cases, relatively substantial sums of money, though not life-changing. Mm-hmm. And so when we think about that was, again, made possible by those conditions that I described earlier. There's a way that one could talk about those investments and talk about them as if these are the kinds of things that should independently make it so that black people are low. Here's an example of how the Biden administration delivered for black people. And I would argue that, as we've talked about in the past, this is one of the tricks that the Democratic Party uses in order to gaslight its base, particularly black folks, to say that they have delivered for black people, is identifying a handful of good things that the Democratic Party was forced to do in order to then make the case that they're delivering for black people.
I think that's an excellent point, Dayvon. And I think that the left has been so beaten down that relatively small things that are important that the Democratic Party is forced to do are being oversold in ways to try to get black folks, but people in general wouldn't sue you. So like this focus on antitrust. When companies merge together, they form a monopoly. And when you merge, you oftentimes fire people. So fighting monopoly power is important. But if you fight mergers, literally all you've done is preserve the status quo. You've not improved anyone's material conditions. So the fact that the Biden administration was better on antitrust than Obama is important. They were forced to be that way. But it also is so inadequate. Literally, you're trying to tell people preserving the status quo is meeting their needs. And again, there's going to be so much talk about this was racism and sexism because Biden was so great on policy. The frame for policy has shifted so far right that just being flatly to the left of that was seen as being good. And many people, I believe, repudiated that in either staying home or voting for Trump.
Right. And I think that's a part of the thing that in conversations about the deficiencies of the Democratic Party in delivering for black people, that's a really important thing to include that, again, mainstream media and conversations about the election, I think, exclude. So what I want to do is I want to actually get very specific in terms of some of the things that the Democratic Party should and could have delivered on in some measure, but has not. And I want to be very specific in responding both to commentary and social media posts that Roland Martin has put up, where he has, on his platform consistently said that, the Biden-Harris administration and that the Democrats generally have delivered for working class people and have delivered for black people. And I've watched some of his programs where he's given what I would describe as some nominal examples, right? Similar to what I said before about the American Rescue Plan and the infrastructure bill, where we know of initiatives that have been funded that have been good for Baltimore and in Maryland that have had some good impacts, but those things by themselves, right, in many respects, is the bare minimum. And so I think there are times when even people who are kind of ideologically aligned with us, I don't know that there's enough conversation about specific policies that would be beneficial to black people that the Democratic Party has failed to deliver on. Now, before I get into some of the specifics, a part of, what I want to make clear to say is that, there are different approaches to having a conversation. So one can have an argument about the Biden-Harris administration. We know that the President of the United States, there are limitations to what the president can do, right? President needs the other branches of government. So, and people experienced the presidential ticket in many respects through the inflection of other Democrats in the party. So one of the things that some folks might do is isolate it and say, well, in the seat of the president of the United States, Biden-Harris did as much as one could do, right? In their official capacity as president and vice president of the United States. Now, those of us that know better understand that the Democratic Party is an institution and that there are ways that while there are specific things around the federal government, there are also ways in which the party itself on a state and local level can take leadership and encourage certain policies further down the local scene. So, for instance, when we look back at the crime bill in 1994, that even though many of the policies put forward by the Clinton administration impacted federal prison and federal policy on mass incarceration, a part of what made it so impactful was that it was copied by state and local, states and local cities and jurisdictions, that it was copied as a result of the fact that the Democratic Party was leading it through Clinton. The crime bill was leading it in that direction. So I'm going to talk about some specific things that may not necessarily be the purview of the president of the United States, but policies that the Democratic Party could deliver for across the board, both at the presidential level, federal congressional level, state legislature level, and even at local municipalities, that the party, if they campaigned on and advocated for, in between elections, and were able to deliver on, would actually demonstrate real material impacts for black people, particularly working class black people. So I'm going to give a few examples. So one of the things that we're seeing is a resurgence in the criminalization of youth, the subjecting young people to incarceration, particularly in the adult system. This is something that we're seeing emerge around the country. We're seeing it here in Maryland. For folks who've listened to us and have read our stuff, an ongoing propaganda war with Sinclair Broadcasting, where they own almost maybe a little more than 250 television stations around the United States, and in many respects propagating the narratives that push forward many of these kind of tough on crime policies that criminalize, Black people in general and Black youth in particular. So we're seeing that resurgence, and Democrats locally have been supportive of it, right? So Democrats in many ways, in some respects, have been indistinguishable from Republicans on that issue.
Yeah, so another example of that, some people have pointed to, is the local Democratic opposition to Cop City in Atlanta. And sort of, again, just sort of moving to the right on criminal justice issues, especially in a key swing state like Georgia, produces a sense of many folks, I'm just going to stay home. So even if you're not seeing folks say crime is the number one issue, a lot of the folks who would be saying that are staying home, and that really implicates the ability for us to see it in the election results.
Another example, we've talked about community-based violence prevention. And while the federal government has provided some support, most of that support was, again, through the American Rescue Plan, right? And that the Democratic Party, continues, when it does invest in community-based violence prevention, invest in some of your traditional big box, white corporate, nonprofit, elite institutions, and not nearly as much investment in Black grassroots organizations being the leaders of community-based violence prevention. So we're talking about an issue of violent crime, which is something that, the Republicans bludgeon Democrats for. So if we're serious about addressing, public safety, there's a way to do it. That's about investing in Black people on the ground doing it. And, there have been several, examples around the country, Baltimore in particular, right, with our, historic decline in homicides and non-fatal shootings, in the midst of a shortage of 500 police officers, according to the Baltimore City Police Department. Again, combined with historic declines, which has been driven, from our perspective, by Black-led grassroots organizations. So again, the Democratic Party, again, an example of to the extent that they delivered on this was to the extent that they were forced to deliver on it.
Absolutely. And I think this is important because when you think about this, I imagine someone from the party was saying, well, we delivered historic declines in violence. They didn't reward us. Now, I think there's a few things to that. First, so much of the programming for this is so far downstream, where folks have already been criminal justice involved, formerly incarcerated, and is run through institutions that are not owned and controlled by community. You're not doing the sorts of upstream interventions that many of the grassroots organizations do. Those organizations don't get funded because the funding is for targeting the people who are most approximate to either shooting or getting shot. And I think that they see that as evidence-based, as targeted, as being efficient in government spending. And many people in the ground experience it as, we did it despite who you invested in. And we did it because of the people you won't really invest in. And I think the last thing I would say, we just talked about this when it comes to violence prevention. They say, no, we're pushing this big multi-billion-dollar bill. Couldn't get it passed. But the people they have pushing it are like NBA players, right? And these sort of cultural figures where it's like, when you take an issue seriously, it's reflected in the way that you approach the issue. And the fact that this issue does not seem to really be taken seriously, except when they're serious about the big nonprofits who they like to work with getting funding. But again, they'll deploy the basketball players to talk to us about why we should support this great work that's happening on the ground, rather than actually lifting up the people from the ground and actually making them have a platform to talk to the community. Because I actually think this would have been one of the best things to run on. It's this historic decline in violence, driven by interventions the Democratic Party could legitimately say they played a role in. But to really further it and to embrace it, they would have had to empower people whose messaging would have challenged things like gentrification, would have challenged things like the nonprofit industrial complex that would not have been useful to the National Democratic Party.
And so even things like one of the things that we have to deal with in Maryland is, still having trouble passing legislation that automatically expunges criminal record, automatically expunges non-conviction from a person's criminal record, right? As an example, right? That's one of those things that should be simple. But prosecutors and law enforcement on the other side of the issue, still remain influential in stopping that kind of legislation from happening. One of the things that we worked on a couple of legislative sessions ago in 2023, because Maryland legalized recreational cannabis, putting it on the ballot in 2022 and then establishing the framework in 2023. Well, we had to fight tooth and nail just to pass a bill that would have that has prohibited law enforcement from using the smell of odor, the odor of cannabis as a pretext for stops and searches. So think about how ridiculous it is that in a state that has legalized a substance, the odor of it was something that law enforcement felt like it needed in order to properly execute their duties. And this was a bill that passed, session ended at 11:59, that night. The bill passed the both chambers. It passed the House at 11:53 that night, of which the Republicans protested on the floor as a result of this passing. And it took tremendous advocacy just to get that passed. So I mentioned that as an example of something that should be a bare minimum, right? So there are ways that the Democratic Party might tout that as, a huge example of them delivering for Black people, because Black people are the ones who are stopped and searched more than any other demographic group as a result of the odor of cannabis. And it's certainly a good thing, right? It is a good step forward. But the fact that something that really should be a no-brainer, right? It should be something that, at the end of the day, is something that should be easy for a Democratic Party that claims to deliver for Black people. For that to be so difficult is evidence of what we're saying in terms of how poorly the Democratic Party is in delivering for Black people. Another example, one of the things that we worked on is reparations. We worked on reparations for the war on drugs. The Democratic Party, I think, has given way to some talks about reparations, I think in some ways out of capitulation to a wing of the Democratic Party that I think uses certain forms of approaches to identity as a way to get around actually talking about substantive economic redistribution. What ends up happening, though, is that the Democratic Party, what we get a lot of are studies and commissions. But in terms of actually making reparations a centerpiece of the Democratic Party agenda, which is hugely popular with Black people, right? Last time I checked, it was about 3/4 of Black folks are polled favorably as it relates to reparations. Now, in the white community, I think it's around 30%, maybe a tad less than that. And so, which kind of foreshadows what I'm going to say at the end in terms of why the Democrats don't deliver. But reparations is something that the masses of Black people support. The fact the Democratic Party has taken such a cautious and taken such a not incremental, but it's taken an approach that really has limited to talking about the issue as opposed to delivering resources in that regard. And some examples of where Democrats have said they're going to make major investments, as Lawrence has alluded to, are really investments in white-led corporate nonprofits and in the human service industry.
Yeah, I think this is important. I'm going to continue to try to link it back to the election and narratives our audience may be hearing about the election. So one narrative that's going is that the Democratic Party appeared to care too much about cultural issues and not about delivering for people. And I think that is used to weaponize discussions about things like reparations to say, no, you can't talk about that. The people just said they don't want that. What I think you're seeing in those polls, and they've been focused a lot on the trans issue, is that people see superficial, culture-based deployment of identity as directly trading off of material engagement. So when you're not serious about delivering for people, you hold up tokens and you hold up culture as a way to absolve the political pressure of delivering materially. So that's going to get held up as transphobia, and that's going to get held up as patriarchy. But I think what you're seeing is Democratic people in the country smelling when they're being sold culture and representation. And the types of people that care about that are elites who are materially secure. So you can deliver for people who can effectively deploy relationships with identity and academic theories for their academic or nonprofit jobs. Having conversations about culture delivers for them, but it does not deliver materially for working class people of many races and genders. And by making reparations essentially a cultural issue as opposed to an issue of material redistribution that could actually improve conditions on the ground in major cities. The types of stuff that people are saying they actually care about. A Democratic Party could argue that investments in black-controlled institutions and containers is the only way to deal with the homelessness in major cities, only way to deal with the addiction crisis in major cities. But they aren't doing that. So reparations becomes only an abstract cultural issue that they get to claim to care about people. And then that triggers the sentiment that you don't actually care about anybody.
And I think, and so to kind of put a bow on the reparations part of this is that even, it has been, black folks, particularly on the more radical political side of the spectrum, that have forced the issue of reparations to even be on the table. And so what that demonstrates is that there is a desire, there is a clear call from working class black people that we want reparations. But the fact that the Democratic Party has trouble delivering on that in any substantive way, again, I think it's evidence of them not delivering. And then other examples, simple things like raising the minimum wage, right? Which is really a baseline thing. I think it's still at like $7.50.
The minimum wage in the state of Pennsylvania is tied to the federal minimum wage, which is $7.50. So a federal minimum wage increase have actually risen the wage in one of the critical swing states.
Right. And so it's one of the, really basic, like very bare minimum. We have a market-based healthcare system. Right. There hasn't been much significant movement towards something that would either be a public option or Medicare for all. And for us, one of the things we would include is, investment in, cultural health and wellness institutions to ensure that there isn't a kind of the same kind of white nonprofit industrial complex monopoly over the industry.
Yeah, just real quick. Another example of that, Dayvon, is an entire campaign run on reproductive justice with little to no talk about reproductive health, maternal mortality, and investments in things like community-controlled birthing centers that would have taken the issue of reproductive justice away from, again, in most states, preserving the status quo towards actually creating active conditions of reproductive justice and institutions the community could have owned and operated to mobilize a black voting base or mobilize an urban voting base that was explicitly demobilized in this campaign.
And then the last example I'll give is, and this actually became an issue during the campaign in terms of rent control policies, right? So as soon as Vice President Harris and her campaign mentioned rent control, there was all the propaganda around, that's a communist policy. And so the Democrats retreated to, well, we're actually not talking about, actual rent control. Right, that they went to something in terms of incentives, like focusing on incentives as it relates to, rents and whatnot. So an example of even when a policy was put on the table that would impact working class black people, clearly corporate interests would make it so that in terms of actually putting forward policy that would dictate like rent controls across the board is something that the Democratic Party retreats from.
Yeah, so that's the larger conversation about price controls for things like eggs and inflation. But on housing, when rent control came up, what they said is, no, we just need to build more housing, right? They didn't say how. And they also didn't say in places where they built more housing, that housing has come in at market rate. So that actually increases the overall housing cost in the market because everyone else is looking at this new market rate housing saying, well, I could be getting that much from my spot. Let me jack my rates up. So their solution is a supply and demand solution, which doesn't deal with the fact this is the commodity you need to live. So people are going to leverage that need to extract every single dime out of people. So it's really just feeding the pockets of developers and future landlords rather than actually getting the price of housing down.
And so, these are just a handful of examples that we wanted to describe specific policies the Democratic Party has not delivered on substantively. Now, I want to just put a caveat that one may find a handful of examples of places around the country where Democrats have delivered in a very minimal way on some of the things that we've talked about, right? And in fact, as we talk about reparations, like we, here in Baltimore and in Maryland have worked on reparations for the war on drugs. And that has been us pushing, locally and pushing the Democrats in that direction. So the extent to which Democrats have delivered on any of this has been because they were forced to, and in many ways forced to by folks that the party has been hostile to politically. So going back to what I said in the beginning about the fact that when folks like Roland Martin are saying that the Democrats have, there was a thing that he did where he was criticizing the statement that Bernie Sanders put out about the fact that the Democratic Party is abandoning the working class. And one of the things that I've seen him say is asking for specifics. And one of the things I would implore those that share, our LBS's political sensibilities in terms of providing some of these specific examples of the kinds of policies that again, for us are like middle of the road. Like there's so much more than what we listed that the Democratic Party should be its North Star in terms of delivering. But many of these things are things that are within the power of the Democratic Party to do. And as I mentioned before, again, there's the president and vice president of the United States, but people experience the Democratic Party as a party. So even though many of the things that we listed are not necessarily things that could be done at a federal level, it is that the way that the Democratic Party influences its electeds all the way down to the local level, the Democratic Party as a party has not delivered for Black people in any measure that anyone should be satisfied with.
Yeah, and thinking about what we talked about before, their theory of change is so tied to getting people in suburbs comfortable with them, which is seen in the data in terms of who turned out and who didn't. They held, for the most part, the suburbs. They lost more ground in the rural areas and the cities. So look at violence prevention. When I'm on the calls for violence prevention nationwide, the people interrupting conflicts, interrupting beefs, part of the reason we got interested in this is because if this works, we don't have to give police departments in Baltimore $600 million a year. But they've been adamant, sometime around 2022, that to state explicitly in all these calls, we are not trying to displace law enforcement. We are a supplement. We are another tool in the toolbox. And I read that as them explicitly trying to cleave this work away from the defund the police movement, explicitly trying to cleave this work away from folks that have been foot soldiers on the ground fighting on criminal justice policy. So we actually saw in California referendum to actually increase certain, shoplifting, quality of life crimes to a felony that passes, trying to get rid of the legal status of forced servitude and slavery in prison that did not pass. So you've demobilized a huge chunk of your base that could hold prosecutors accountable from overcharging, that could hold the people overcharging youth accountable. And you've told them, we're going to sacrifice you to make people in the suburbs happy with the Democratic Party, and this is what you got.
And so in many respects, I would say that the general electoral landscape and the Democratic Party in particular is at a crossroads. Because, and we've talked about this in the past, where the Democrats could make a choice between investing in independent Black electoral infrastructure pursuant to getting, and mobilizing in those critical swing states, Atlanta and Georgia and Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, Milwaukee and Wisconsin, and Detroit and Michigan. Like there are the investment in independent Black electoral infrastructure the Democratic Party would put, and the demographics are such that this could be a extremely formidable strategy in national elections if the Democratic Party would lean into that. And as we talked about at the very beginning, is that would trade off with the existent consultant class within the Democratic Party, those Democratic Party consultants and operatives that are beholden to a corporate element of the party that again disincentivizes giving over all of that power, particularly to working class Black people. And I think what we have seen is that the Democratic Party, even for its own electoral sake, will not go in that direction. And so this is why when folks like us and others have conversations about building electoral political machinery and infrastructure outside of the Democratic Party, this is where that becomes viable. Because I think too often people describe votes outside of the Democratic Party as protest votes. But I think we have to get serious about if the Democratic Party is not going to do what is in its own electoral interest, which is investing in independent Black electoral infrastructure, then we have to build something outside of it to create leverage to bring it closer to our community, right? And that's a more complex question, I think, for another time to do kind of an extensive deep dive into. Whether it's, the Green Party, whether it's the Party for Socialism and Liberation, whether it's, the People's Party, I think is the vehicle that Cornel West is trying to build. So there are a wide range of electoral infrastructure outside of the Democratic Party to discuss what specifically that looks like. But the point that I want to make is that is the place that if we're serious about Black liberation and contesting for power as a people in this settler colony, then we have to then start having conversations about what does it look like to build infrastructure outside of the Democratic Party, knowing what the Democratic Party is likely going to do.
The Democratic Party, you're already seeing it. Some people saying it should run John Fetterman, the extremely pro-Zionist senator from Pennsylvania. Some people want to run the governor from Pennsylvania. Because the crazy thing about this election is not so much, to me, that Kamala lost. The crazy thing is that she almost won. And so they're still going to think that it's only 100,000 votes in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. I know it looks like an electoral blowout, but that's not how they think. They target specific states. They look at the fact that they held critical states in the Senate and House and say, if we had the same campaign with someone not tied to Biden, especially a white man, that we're going to win. So it's stunning because the data shows that the Latinx, or whatever you want to call it, vote is shifting far to the right. Not just Latinx men, but also Latinx in general. It's really just the Black people. So if the Democratic Party were smart, they would double and triple down on the people that actually show up for them, which would be the Black folks. But given what we understand about how disruptive that is to the party infrastructure, I mean, you have to look at alternative ways of delivering politically and targeting issues of leverage. So, statewide, there's probably going to be a budget crunch at some point with the ARPA money running out and economic growth being slow. So states like Pennsylvania, potentially even Georgia, North Carolina, critical swing states are probably going to legalize cannabis to get that revenue. So it's just an opportunity to mobilize Black folks around a local reparations agenda in those critical swing states to actually be antagonistic to the Democratic Party's attempt to gatekeep those efforts and put them into their machine. So this is really a critical moment as we see, possible cuts in federal spending, creating economic shortfalls and budget shortfalls in states. What can you do to build local power? Here in Baltimore, Sinclair Media put a ballot initiative that would shrink the city council on the ballot. And we had, a coalition that included the Green Party that was able to actually beat that back. And we have a Green Party candidate running for governor here in 2026. So that all of these moments where you're going to get told you cannot do that. It's a protest vote. You're not going to get any leverage. But again, if you have a platform that's going to run on abortion and not even make a concrete commitment on reproductive justice for Black women, despite the massive, horrifying disparities in maternal health, if an issue that polls very well with exactly the people you need to turn out, the disaffected voters in these cities, you need some leverage to make them actually care. And so I think these are the debates that we have to have coming forward, and this is the reality that we have to take even in the midst of what we're going to get told is fascism, what we're going to get told is an unprecedented attack on our rights. We have to see that it is the political failure of the Democratic Party that put us in this situation. And are we going to double and triple down on that failure, or are we going to try to open up space for something different? We hope you've enjoyed this special election episode of In Search of Black Power. For those who want to go deeper on some of the things that we've talked about here, I would like to recommend the book Worse Than Trump, The American Plantation by Dayvon Love. As it looks like we're heading back to some of the media discourse and political questions of 2016 and I believe 2018, Dayvon published a book basically arguing that the concern about Trump being a unique threat to American democracy obscures the quotidian, everyday neglect and failure of the Democratic Party, which could arguably be worse than Trump. And I think that in terms of the road not traveled, in terms of the celebrities who were platformed and the discourses that were platformed last time that got us here, engaging that text might be a good way to get some perspective on what we have gone through to get to this moment. And some ideas about alternative choices to get us to not have to be here again 4 years from now. So that, as well as our archive of podcasts and more information about all the work we do, is on our website, lbsbaltimore.com. We'd like to thank you all for supporting us throughout the year on this podcast feed. It is definitely something that we try to commit to, but in addition to being researchers and public speakers and policy advocates and consultants, being audio engineer and doing all logistics for a podcast has definitely been a stretch, which is why, one of the many reasons why the video format, I think, was no longer going to fit within the model of what we had availability for. But we look forward to being on other podcasts. If you have folks that are doing analysis that may have interest in what we're doing, please tell us, or please tell other folks that you want us on their show. We have an episode coming up that is going to list a bunch of people whose shows we have watched and we would love to be on. So if you're fans of those shows and fans of ours, and you find this form of dialogue engaging, we would love to be further in dialogue with folks. So please feel free to write me, Lawrence, Lawrence, at LBS, the letters L, letter B, letter S, Baltimore.com. And please continue to follow Black Liberation Media as the collective goes into this new year. We're hoping to continue to provide you the content analysis you need to understand and deconstruct these unprecedented yet, unfortunately, far too precedented times. So with that, if we don't see you again, Happy New Year, and look forward to 2025, continuing to go in search of Black Power. See you on the other side of the new year.